Welcome to the G3 podcast. We're glad to have you joining us today, and I'm very pleased to have my good friend Uriesou Brito join me on the podcast. Uri is pastor of Providence Church in Pensacola, Florida, and currently presiding minister of the CREC. Uri, thanks so much for coming on to the G3 podcast.
Always a delight to be with you, Scott. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. So, Uri, you and I met in 2020 through a mutual friend, Jared Ritchie. Jared had just started a PhD program with me at Southwestern, and you've been friends with Jared for a long time. And he invited me to speak in Monroe in conjunction with the music camp that you've been a part of a long time. And for some reason, he keeps inviting me back. And so you and I met in 2020, but we sort of developed a friendship over these 5 years.
Yeah, it's been great to build this bond with you, and we do have the distinct privilege of blaming Jared for just about everything.
That's right. Blame Jared for the good and blame Jared for the bad.
Exactly.
Yeah. But, I think our friendship is interesting. We have a lot in common. In fact, we have a kind of a common background, a lot of similar interests and similar values that we hold and similar things that we think are important. But we also have some differences too. And I think, one of the similarities I think you and I have is both of us desire to be bridge builders. And we like to see different men who might have some differences, but who share values on the most important things come together. And I think that's one of the things that's sort of bonded you and I together so strongly is that common bond and common desire.
Yeah, and I think life becomes just a little bit simpler that way when you're attempting to build bridges, but also there's a distinct sense in which the face-to-face interaction does erase the kind of perceived differences that exist. And I think, as we all know, the virtual world has made that utterly complicated, but I think our friendship, our ability to minister together in a particular context, together face-to-face and watching each other do what God has called us to do, it's hard for that not to cause a very unique brotherhood and Christian bond. Yeah,
absolutely. But like I mentioned too, we have some differences theologically. You're, post-mill Presbyterian theonomist, and I'm not, right? Yeah. And but interestingly, and this is gets into our topic for the day, I think it's exactly where you and I. Our similarities and our differences, where they converge, that both of us, as we've had conversations even in recent years, have a little bit of a rising concern about something that we're seeing, on the landscape in modern evangelicalism. Like you mentioned, a lot of it's online, but it's starting to creep into our churches. And that is the rise of a sort of anti-Semitism sentiment that we're seeing out there. I think it's safe to say that both of us have sort of begun to be concerned about this. Is that correct?
That's correct. I think the concern stems from various categories and sort of motifs. But for me, as somebody who's spent most of my academic world interested in pastoral theology, my fundamental concern as a minister of the gospel is pastoral. Some may have sociological concerns, cultural concerns. These are all a part of it. But for me, it's a pastoral concern because I firmly believe in the role and the centrality of the church in these endeavors.
Yeah. I think, what's interesting is, and I've written an article on this and done a recent podcast on how Christians should view Israel. And you and I probably have a little bit of a difference just in terms hermeneutically, how Israel factors into the purposes and plans of God. But regardless, and this is kind of what I emphasized in my recent podcast, is that even if you're somebody who sees, whether you're somebody who sees a future for national Israel or even sees a current, special place for Israel, or if you're not, there are still certain values and ways that we should approach the issues of nations and ethnicity and culture that should be firmly rooted and grounded in the Word of God. And this should unite us. This should not be something that divides us.
Yes, and I want to add just one area here, one qualification here. You mentioned earlier, I am a postmillennialist. I fall into the sort of the theocratic scheme of things, especially held by men like James B. Jordan. And what the theocratic position sort of entails is there is a centrality to the role of the church in human affairs and society affairs. It's Zion, city of our God, as we sing. And because of that, there is a kind of universality that does not allow for a particularization of interest in a nation, because the church has become that royal priesthood, that royal nation. Nevertheless, I always want to add, and I think I mentioned this briefly in my interview with Man Rampant with Douglas Wilson, that when we think about the future of Israel and however we ended up interpreting Romans 11 and all that eschatological text, for me, it's impossible to view the role of Israel without understanding its hermeneutical application or hermeneutical treasures that are invested in it. In other words, however you define these categories, there must be a Hebraic element to the Christian faith, that without which Christianity, the New Testament, New Covenant thinking does not function as it is properly set up to function. And so my desire when I think about these things is there is a unique difference from a Jewish person becoming a Christian and a Muslim becoming a Christian. The Jewish person brings a high degree of what I call hermeneutical treasures that are now incorporated into this grandiose tree called Christendom that the Muslim does not bring, that the atheist does not bring, that the Buddhist does not bring. And so I want to, that's a significant element, a component that often gets overlooked. And however we interpret eschatologically Romans 11, I think that's something that needs to be brought into the conversation.
Yeah, that's really good and helpful. What really interested me, even just preparing for this discussion, I was doing some reading, and I didn't even realize that some postmillennial, even theonomists, like even Wilson, do see a sort of current special status for Israel, right? I mean, I think you don't, but there's even a little bit of intramural discussion amongst postmill theonomists on that matter, right?
Yeah, quite a bit, actually. There's been a renewed interest in preterist understandings of Romans 9 through 11. Mm-hmm. And some of my heroes hold to a fairly preterist view of those chapters. I don't. And it should be noted that it's a newer understanding of Romans 9 through 11. That's not part of the Reform corpus at all when it comes to these kinds of passages. The primary interpretation in Romans 11, at least within the Reformed Presbyterian tradition, and certainly the Westminsterian tradition, is that there is a future renewal, a future revival that will stir the nations. And that revival can only emerge or have its genesis when ethnic Israel enters into this great era of revival, so that they would inaugurate this season, and therefore that would trigger the nations from coming. That would trigger the nations to coming into the this greater revival of civilization. And I think that we have to deal with that. And in many ways, in order for us to claim this reformational heritage, we have to accept that has been the preeminent view even among postmillennialists. And we can't put that aside. And so in particular, I hold to Calvin's interpretation of Romans 11, where he speaks of where all Israel be saved is a reference to the church of both Jews and Gentiles. Nevertheless, I find myself offering an extra degree of sympathy to that other side of postmillennialism of men that we love, like Ian Murray, for example, and who wrote the great Puritan Hope. And so that has to be kept in the conversation. I think we have to allow room for these things. So it's not foreign to the Reformed corpus. It's very much part of the DNA of the Reformed corpus.
Yeah, absolutely. And you stated a moment ago exactly what I was thinking here. What this illustrates is that even within Reformed traditions, there are differences and nuances of views regarding the present status of Israel, the future status of Israel, how we ought to view these things, and that's okay. That's healthy. These are complicated issues, and we have to be willing to discuss these with grace toward one another. We can hold to our positions with conviction, but also show grace to one another on the particular applications and views regarding the nation of Israel.
That's correct. And I know what the language is being used today, how the language is being used, or anyone who sort of views the nation of Israel with any sense of degree or percentage of favorability is viewed as, sort of theological persona non grata, but they have to wrestle with their own Reformed tradition before they make these assertions.
Yeah, absolutely. So, when we talk then about our concern with the growth of anti-Semitism, I think it might be helpful for us first to talk about what anti-Semitism is not. So, for example, I made this argument in a recent podcast to criticize something that the current nation state of Israel is doing. To criticize them, that is not anti-Semitism. To say, I disagree with this particular decision that Netanyahu makes, that's not anti-Semitism, right? Those things are fully fair game. We can criticize a political decision made by the modern nation state of Israel.
Well, we should, and I think that kind of language is drafted in such a way to draw us away from the actual issue. Nobody, certainly not in my world, and I work as presiding minister of CREC. No one who is concerned about these tendencies, these trajectories we see in our present culture or online culture. No one says you are therefore prohibited from criticizing Benjamin Netanyahu and his policies. That's right. But that's used as as a weapon against our position. And I think it's foolish, it's simplistic, and obviously they should know better.
Yeah, it is used as a weapon. To give sort of the benefit of the doubt, there are some politicians on the right who sometimes do talk that way. Like any criticism whatsoever of Israel is anti-Semite. But I'm with you. When we're talking about the Reformed world, the world in which we live, and church culture, there's nobody who would say it's anti-Semitic to simply criticize the modern nation state of Israel. So that's not, as we then move into a discussion of what we are concerned about, that's not what we're talking about, right? It's perfectly acceptable to do that. And I agree with you, it's often used as a weapon. So what then would you say, like how would you define anti-Semitism? What are some of the things that you're seeing, that you're hearing, that you're seeing online? What is giving you some concern when it comes to how people are speaking about Jews and Israel?
Douglas Wilson has a great book where he is sort of opined on these issues here. I like his definition quite well when he speaks of that anti-Semitism is the notion that Jews are, I think he phrased it, uniquely malevolent and destructive in their cultural, political influence, right? So there is just to use the Gerardian language, that Israel becomes a scapegoat for every single societal woe. And that goes from why I can't find a girlfriend, right? This is a common argument. It's a problem of the Jews. Or why the United States has found itself in this political conundrum. It's the problem of the Jews. Or it's because there's a particularity of the Jewish people drawing back to their crucifixion of Messiah Jesus. All these questions need to be parsed, of course, but that's how it's framed. Mm-hmm. And because of that, the Jewish people, through their Talmudic religion, they now possess a disproportionate influence in American culture, and they're infiltrating every single sphere of American political society. And it's that kind of thing, it's that kind of over fascination, is that kind of creative ability to turn the Jewish people into almost like a kind of superhero status, where they're blamed for being a capitalistic people, and then they're blamed for being a fascist people. And so they're blamed for everything under the sun. And a quick perusal, Scott, through history of anti-Semitism will reveal very clearly that the Jews have been blamed in society for everything by everyone. And so my encouragement to those who would formulate these kinds of criticisms is make up your mind on what the Jews are responsible for. And once you make up your mind, we can begin to address whether that's legitimate or not. And so, but it's that unique malevolence of the Jewish people. That's my concern. When we were in Oxford last year, and there we were in this remarkable historical context, having coffee, and around there were anti-Israel tents with Free Palestine signs everywhere. And these tents were taking over Oxford in every part of their massive landscape there. And no one had the courage to to do anything about it. And so that being anti-Israel has given you the kind of kudos and the kind of permissibility, whether you're on the left or on the right. And so that's become universal. And that's when you know something is off. Why is the left so antagonistic towards Israel? Certainly their telos is very different than those of us on the right.
Right.
And why are some on the right so fascinated with blaming Israel for everything? Their telos should be much more like ours, but nevertheless, it's taken a different direction. So that's where I see some of the difficulties in kind of parsing this conversation out.
Yeah. So, like you said, anti-Semitism and kind of blaming the Jews for everything has been around forever. What do you think accounts for the rise on the right, and in particular, even among people in maybe our circles, like young Reformed white men? Why is this infatuation with blaming the Jews on everything? Where is it coming from?
Well, I think many of those who sort of play sociologists on TV have attempted to answer that question. And I think we are, to borrow Aaron Wren's language, we are living in a negative world, even though I think some of that conversation needs to be updated a bit in the last couple of years. But we still live, let's say, for the sake of conversation, in a negative world. And obviously, as we know, COVID has provided this ability for a lot of men in particular to reinvent themselves or to undergo this kind of imaginative revival. And as a result of this reinvention, they felt that the state had lied to them in a very profound way, but not just the state, but they felt like the ecclesiastical authorities have lied to them. They felt mommy and daddy have lied to them. And so it's the combination of all these three spheres that they perceive to have been deeply faulty. And it's not just the boomer generation, it's everybody underneath that everybody has failed them, all three main spheres, family, church, and state. Because of that, now they feel they have this legitimate ability to reinvent their masculinity, reinvent the way they ought to think about society, and to use a language a bit more technical here, to reinvent a kind of hermeneutical scheme by which they interpret reality. And because of that, now they are starting with tabula rasa. They're starting from a blank slate. And now they're able to write in their poor cursive style a new way of thinking about reality, a new way of thinking about societal concerns, political concerns. And at that point, there are certain key figures rising as kind of these cultural iconoclasts who are saying, here's an objective way of looking at civilization. Here's an objective way of understanding reality that will make sense out of your sociological despair. And they're jumping in and they're providing a kind of a new hermeneutical lenses to read everything around them. So that's, at the very least, I'd say that's the beginning of this new way of looking and this new generation that are now attempting to understand what's before them. And obviously, I think they're misguided for a host of reasons. We can talk about that as well.
I would like to personally invite you to join Joel Beakey, Jeff Johnson, David DeBrain, and several others for our G3 conference this February 12th through 14th, 2026. Our theme is Christian Unity. Visit events.g3min.org/unity for more information and to register. We only have a limited number of seats, so please register today. Yeah. I think that's really helpful, and I think too, it is true that in particularly in our culture and in our country today, white cisgender Protestant men have been attacked for a long time, and so now you have again these same young men who see that, and they're right. That's not a good thing. But what you're saying is there's also this mixture of distrust in anything that they've ever been taught by any authority, whether it be a government or church or family, and so they're running to these voices who are offering some sort of an alternative solution.
That's exactly correct. And I think there's been a certainly unhealthy bifurcation of political and ecclesiastical categories, so that in the political category, the concept of the fruit of the Spirit, the virtues of Western civilization, that has all been despised for particular political ends. Now, I understand the role of political pragmatism. I think there's good conversation to be had around these things, but it strikes me as a bit odd, Scott, that we want to preserve, protect, and provide a Western civilization that we all want to live in, but therefore abandoning the virtues that made Western civilization. And I think among those great virtues, and I've been thinking about this for quite some time, among those great virtues, I think the underappreciated virtue of self-control is one that needs to be certainly brought back into the conversation, because now we have an entire generation of men who think that self-control is a matter of weakness. It's a matter. It's an effeminate trait, and the very essence of Western civilization was composed and written by men who treasured self-control, who did not fall a prey for false teachers, did not fall prey to the Ariuses of this world or the Anabaptists or the revolutionaries, but now they're finding a home and a refuge in this world. And so wherever virtue is absent, what's going to happen is a new form of so-called virtuous society is going to jump in and take that role. So everyone has virtues, We are advocating for a distinctly Western biblical lineup or paragon of virtues. But there are some who are going to come in and say, no, it is also virtuous to act in a way that destroys irenicism or destroys the ability to have deep, profound conversations. And ultimately, we know these are all satanic lies masquerading as virtues. They may use the word, but it has a very different meaning.
Yeah, I think that's a really, really strong point, a really helpful point, because most of these same young Christian men who are falling into some of these traps are the same sorts who say, this is a Christian nation and we need to reclaim this nation for Christ. And what you're saying is, okay, yes, let's do that, which includes the virtues that come from the Spirit and virtues of Christ-likeness. We need to manifest and embody all of these things. Yes,
and I think I don't know who brought this concept recently. It might have been Steve Days, who's just a wonderful commentator on some modern issues. But I think the religious right, our tribe, we might say, is undergoing this kind of generational reckoning after decades of failure. We all thought that Ronald Reagan was our Messiah. We all thought that George W. Bush was our Messiah. We've all have this sense. In other words, we have trusted in princes far more than Messiah Jesus. And I do want to see a renewed vision. I am a theocrat. I have the idea. I have all that to prove my point here. We do have a renewed vision of what the role of the civil sphere is. I think government needs to have a fundamental role, at least in proposing a kind of general welfare that would benefit Christendom over other religions, certainly over Islam, certainly over Judaism as well. But I think our primary concern today, unlike what some may think, I think is Islam, certainly not Yoram Hazony or Orthodox Judaism, who voted, by the way, 84% in favor of Donald Trump. That's something to keep in mind. But we are going through this generational reckoning, and the attempts that have been made by our forefathers didn't work and didn't equip many conservative young men and women, didn't equip many conservative churches for what COVID did. COVID was a kind of generational testing that the church obviously failed, but the response to it is not, therefore, the church has nothing to say to us. Therefore, our forefathers, our grandfathers have nothing to say to us. Therefore, our parents have nothing to say to us. Therefore, our pastors have nothing to say to us. Our response is, where then do we provide a framework whereby we can interpret these things while staying deeply connected to our families and our churches as well? Because the end result obviously has been a kind of what I refer to, Scott, as an ecclesiastical anarchism. And that has led men into directions. They have now formulated virtual communities, which, by the way, will never provide the kind of comfort and consolation that these men need in their deepest hour.
That's right.
And that's deeply problematic to bifurcate political pursuits from the certainty and the confidence that we have in the Lord who has purchased the church with his own blood.
Yeah, amen, absolutely. So what do you say to, maybe some pastors out there who say things like, well, some of these concerns of these young men are true, and we need to allow them to express their angst. Yeah. And if we push back against this anti-Semitism, if we push back against these sorts of things, or if we criticize some of these truly horrendous anti-Semite voices like Nick Fuentes and others, if we criticize them, then we're actually going to turn away the young men. And no, we need to bring these young men in, and we need to sort of, I guess, pat them on the head and say, yes, you're right, and just sort of coddle them in their, in sort of their angst. What do you say to pastors who are thinking that way?
I think I would want to reframe the way they're thinking about these kinds of questions. If the concern is, we're not going to grow, we're not going to have influence, we're not going to accomplish X, Y, or Z unless we embrace these kinds of, honestly, I think these are satanic figures in my mind. They offer nothing beneficial except a form of distorted outline that appears to be headed towards our own trajectory, but I think it's deceitful, which, by the way, is actually the way that I think the devil works. The devil is not going to provide these kinds of figures who are aligned with us in every way. He's going to provide these kinds of screw-tape nephews who are going to offer an outline that on the surface looks like it's our outline, but if you look at the subsets, it's very distorted. They're going in a different direction altogether. And so back to your question, I would want to formulate the question by saying it's not so much, are we going to grow or are we going to have the influence? Because I think the reality, this is a separate question, but I think the reality is that the churches, in my estimation, I can speak from at least the CREC, who are thriving, and our churches are growing in America. It's really hard to keep up with the interest. The churches that are thriving the most in the CREC, at least numerically, are churches that have made very explicit comments and observations on these dangerous and deadly trajectories. So we should keep that in the conversation as well. It's not accept or fail to thrive. In our case, has been reject, and therefore you shall thrive. Yeah. But I want to pose the issue in terms of the pastoral concern and then the pugilistic or divisive concern within the church. So if someone were to come to my congregation here in Pensacola, we've made a fairly direct statement on these issues. But if they were to come and they were to say something like, I have concerns about the nation of Israel, how Benjamin Netanyahu is waging war, a potential Gaza genocide, all these kinds of talking points that I've heard, ad nauseum. If they have these concerns, or they might even say, listen, I have been reading the American Conservative for some time. I have a great fascination for Patrick J. Buchanan, and he shares some concerns about the nature of World War II. I don't have any problems entering these conversations. In fact, I have been in them for a long time. But there is a difference between a pastoral concern about or entering into these conversations with men who are genuinely interested. If they say, I've been listening to this podcast, I listened to something on Joe Rogan or Tucker, and I have questions. I can spend years and years having these kinds of dialogues. But what I have found is that whereas there may be 1 out of 10 who fit that category, the other 9 have something much different in mind. They have a particular agenda in mind. It's never simply a question of a World War II precise point of conversation about something that happened between 1940 and 1945, but it's a far greater project. And I think what we need to do is, where these conversations do take place, and they should take place, we as ministers need to ask further questions. What, therefore, do you intend to do with these questions? What if I give you answers that do not fit your sort of assumed answers that you expect from me? What are you going to do with that? Are you going to build sort of secret societies within the church that is going to condemn the pastor for not feeling strongly enough against Netanyahu, or condemning the pastor for not prosecuting Israel and their particular policies, or condemning the pastors for not speaking strongly enough against AIPAC, or whatever it may be, that then enters into a 1 Corinthians 11 to 14 category of the unity of the church. And Paul has very distinct arguments for why unity ought to take place. And so as long as the questions are questions that pertain to distinct issues of history, and there's simply an interest to know, that's okay. We can continue to converse.
Yeah.
But as I said before, usually these questions are not divorced from particular answers that they already expect. Mm-hmm. And sometimes when the pastor does not fit that particular mold, and then it creates a kind of snowball effect of skepticism that these people have, to the point where I have seen happening in various churches, because I receive these emails, these conversations. There are, believe it or not, there are men who refuse to tithe to particular churches because the pastor doesn't feel a certain way about the Jews.
Yeah.
There are men who have made this statements where they have said, we will no longer submit to the authority of the local pastor because he doesn't have the same position I do regarding the Jews. We will no longer participate in the festivities of the church because the pastor or the staff or the session does not have a particular view of the Jews that I do. That is when things become divisive and they enter into the 1 Corinthians category as opposed to the category of discipleship and nurture and admonition. And I want to keep these two things very separate.
Yeah, that's very helpful. So what's the biblical solution then? What are the biblical and pastoral ways to try to address these, maybe again some legitimate concerns that young men have? I mean, you've already, I think, helpfully said, first you've got to ask questions to determine is this person genuinely interested in answers, or do they have another agenda? I think that was really helpful. But how would you advise a pastor or a father who is speaking to a young man and they're wrestling with some of this angst? They are genuinely concerned about the anti-God things happening in our country. They genuinely want to see Christ glorified in our nation, but they're buying into some of these arguments by some of these voices and even some of this anti-Semitism. What's the biblical solution?
Well, the biblical solution is not the abandonment of the things that God has said to be true and good. And among those things are those in authority that God has placed over you. Hebrews 13 has a fairly distinct sort of imperative there to honor those who have authority over you. And it will not go well with you if you don't do these things. Now, we want to, of course, there are pastors who don't deserve to be submitted to, There are many false teachers today, and we need to contemplate these issues. That's significant enough. But the solution to that is not to say, therefore, I'm going to be authority in and of itself. I'm going to take that authority to myself, and I will allow no one else to have a voice in my life, the life of my family. I'm going to rather take this virtual minister who is distant from me, somebody who is online, who appears to be speaking the things I want to hear, and therefore I'm going to treat them as my pastors. And as I said before, the problem with that is, who is going to be there when grandma's dying in the hospital? Who is going to be there when Johnny has a concussion after on the skateboard? Who's going to be there when your wife is dying of cancer? Who's going to be there for these things? Mm-hmm. So my first encouragement is that anyone not abandon the things that God, through Jesus Christ, has declared to be good and true. And that is the life of the local church, the community local church, those whom God has placed in authority over you, your pastor, your elder, your deacons, those who are the gray hair in your congregation. Now, the second thing, of course, is I think needs to take place is that it's also very important. I think there's a point to be made here that we don't want to despise the youth. Mm-hmm. And so pastors need to be self-aware that youth will have youthful questions. And I think this falls under these categories. These are youthful questions pertaining to zeal, questions pertaining to fervor, questions pertaining to use Francis Schaeffer's line, how shall now we then live in light of this chaos that we find ourselves in? And at that point, I think it's beneficial for ministers to bring these men in their 20s or 30s into their fundamental responsibilities, prioritize their loves, order their loves in such a way that they realize that the things that are most important are not the things they can't control, but the things that they can control. And so my concern in these situations is that pastors are failing to bring these men closer. And the way to bring them closer is to bring them into a circle of discipleship that allows them to ask these questions unhindered, but also that allows a minister to say, what does your life of piety look like at this stage? What is your engagement with pornography? What is your love towards your family look like? What does your love towards your wife looks like? Are these loves in their proper place? And very often what I have found, Scott, is that these loves are not in their proper place. And so therefore they're dedicating whatever remainder of their energies are left to these kinds of things. And so I think the ordering of loves is a fundamental thing in order to reorient the priorities of these particular concerns. And so the pastoral responsibility is to bring these men so that they do not lose their first love while chasing after other loves.
That's really, really helpful. Yeah, that's a good call for all of us. And I think too, this is a time maybe even for a wake-up call for those of us who are in ministry, for those of us who are a little older. I never thought I'd put myself in that category, but apparently now I am. That because you'll see people say, well, your generation dropped the ball, or men of your generation and the previous generations didn't stand up and didn't take the lead, and there might be some truth to that. But what is the solution? Well, let's stand up. Let's be men. Let's be biblical men who exhibit virtues of Christ and of His Spirit. Let's take the lead where we ought to. And if previous generations did fail in that, well, let's do that. But I think, as you just so helpfully said, that doesn't mean giving up biblical virtue. It doesn't mean removing yourself from the local church and from having rightly ordered loves. It means immersing yourselves in the Word of God, immersing yourself in the local church, in the ordinary means of grace that God has given us, in our families, and maturing and growing in Christ-likeness, that He might be glorified in how we interact with others and how we stand up for truth, even in a very chaotic culture.
Hearty amen, brother. Hearty amen.
Yeah. Well, Uri, thank you so much for spending this time and for your wisdom, and just so grateful for your voice in this matter. I think, both of us, all of us, we want to see young men and women in our churches take that zeal and use it for good. Like you said, that is a wonderful thing. And if we can channel that in ways that are good for the glory of God and for His church and for the strengthening of our nation, these are all good things. So I so much appreciate you taking time to share your wisdom on this matter.
Thank you, Scott. Good to be with you, and may the Lord bless the labors of G3, brother.
Thank you so much. Well, thank you for listening to the G3 podcast. Please subscribe on the various podcasting services. And if you're watching on YouTube, please subscribe and hit the little bell so that you know when the next episode comes out. And we do hope that you will join us next time for the G3 podcast. In a culture increasingly adrift from truth, the church must be anchored to the Word of God. That is why G3 Ministries exists, to edify, encourage, and equip God's people with biblical truth for faithful living. Through our conferences, publishing, and streaming resources, we labor to strengthen pastors, families, and local churches for the glory of God. This vital work, however, is not possible alone. We are a ministry supported by the generous partnership of believers like you. Would you prayerfully consider a financial gift to help us continue this mission? Your support directly fuels the creation of trustworthy resources for saints around the world. Please visit g3min.org/give to partner with us today.